I got the new knock sensor installed and tightened them down to 29 foot-pounds. Just try not to crimp this hose too much, just enough to get her done. I took a shop vac and shop vac all loose debris off. Go ahead and remove the gaskets and clean the surfaces up. I just buffed the 4 water outlets with some 600 grit sandpaper and degreased the intake ports. Don't have to get too medieval on it, as long as the water jackets are pretty flat, not pitted up too much. I'll go ahead and lay the new gaskets on there. The new gaskets are laid in there. The new knock sensor harness is routed. And cleaned the water outlet up with some 600 grit and wire brushed off this nipple. So I'm going to go ahead and degrease this with some brake cleaner and slip it down in there and fish it back into that pipe. I just held the housing down and then stuck the 2 end nuts with their washers on and run them down hand tight, and then put the 2 studs, the 2 bolts in the back, and just run it all down to about 5 foot-pounds for now. And slide this clamp back into its original position. If you haven't done so, clean the intake ports up, and particularly around the water jackets, I use some 600 grit to polish them a little bit and degrease the whole thing with brake cleaner. I've checked all the intake valves for any debris laying on them. It's good. Got everything out of the way. I'm going to lower the intake down onto it. The harness is in there and plugged in. Should be good to lower the intake down if it's clean. Make sure there's no debris on the water jacket ports. Keep in mind the fuel line, fish down through them hoses as you install this into it, and it's all good. This fuel line routes underneath of this, underneath there, and underneath the accelerator cable, and it delivers out right there near the fuel line hookup. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and slid the intake down on there. It's pretty uneventful. Put all the nuts and bolts on it and just kind of start from the center and work my way out and gradually tighten them for 10 foot-pounds. The intake bolts will tighten down to 11 foot-pounds, 12 for good measure. The water outlet bolts, all 4 of them, are all tightened down. Go ahead and plug this coolant sensor back in and start hooking these grounds back up and putting this engine stabilizer bracket and bolts back in the side bracket here. Feel free to plug all the injectors back in and clean this surface up for the upper intake plenum. The grounds are hooked back up and the engine stabilizer brackets tightened down and back into place. The new gasket's installed. Clean the upper plenum off, degrease it, and start slipping it on there. Make sure all the underbelly work's done. And the heater hoses can be slipped on about any time. Keep the wires out of the way for the solenoid controls. Lay the plenum in there and reattach the ground wire to this 10mm here. I've set the plenum on there. The ground's tight in the back. I run these down but didn't tighten them up. I want a little bit of movement in this thing so I can get this jewel back in that back bracket. I'm going to stick a spacer underneath of it so that the head will stick up farther in case I have to come back in here again. Maybe a fat washer or a couple of them under it. There's a PCV valve vent needs hooked up too, and the ground's hooked back up in this corner. Be sure and put some protective gloves on or wrap a shop towel around your knuckles before getting against that black fiberglass putting this back in. To mirror the center of the threads with the hole in the bracket to get that back support bracket bolt in place, and just jiggled the plenum until the thread started, and that bolt tightens down to 14 foot-pounds, and I'm going to tighten these plenum bolts down to 31 foot-pounds. Went ahead and installed a new gasket on the throttle body mount, and I'm going to go ahead and stick the throttle body on there, degrease this face before installing it, and ease it up into place and tighten those nuts down. On the home stretch now, feel free to hook the brake booster vacuum line back up and move this solenoid set back on top of the 10mm studs mounted on the intake plenum, and start hooking vacuum lines back up. And feel free to put the lower heater hoses back into place, and these lower water bypass hoses back on the intake, and this bypass here back onto that. Start putting the grommets back into place, the support brackets, and whatever loose change is hanging around. And this hose back on. The 10mm bolts holding this solenoid pack down, and the 10mm bolts that holds this harness in place. This one's busted all to pieces now. I mean, worse. Most of the vacuum lines, heater hoses, bypass water outlets, and hoses are hooked up. And the grounds are hooked up. Fuel lines clipped back together and the lock put on it. Now I can put this throttle body hose back on there. Get it prepped for the air cleaner. Now feel free to put the cruise control back on and leave the one nut in place and tighten the one you loosen back against it so it'll be set right. The solenoids and wire harnesses are back into place. Moving right along. Looks pretty good. Put this fresh air vent hose back on. Everything's back together. All the hoses are hooked up. Mass airflow sensor, clamps are tight. The vent valve, purge valve is hooked up for the vent. Looks like it's ready to accept some antifreeze. Sounds like a plan to me. I'm going to leave the beauty cover off till take it for a ride and make sure everything's okay. It did good. I took it for a good 10 or 12 mile drive a couple of times, and the code's gone, so it's not setting any other codes. I'm going to go ahead and do a transmission fluid change on it because it's got some black on the stick. That should take care of the business. Put a beauty cover back on it.